You see a lot of familiar faces, and for the people that don't know where the AVA ranch is, it lies pretty much to the north of Portal, a few miles wide and several miles long. The history goes back, and trying to compress 100 and something years in 30 minutes is not going to be easy, but we'll see what we can give you in terms of a few highlights. We can go back, this is a picture of hay in the late 70s, but anyhow, that was kind of an introductory picture. But we go back to the probably 1885. I noticed or seen a burial site for 50 years, never could figure out what the heck it was until I read the Sweeney book about Cochise to Geronimo, and apparently they killed an unidentified prospector and buried him there, and so I have an answer to my question, I hope. Anyhow, we go back many years. John Hands was one of the originators of the AVA. I mean, before it was the AVA. He was born in 1866 in England. Read a brochure that the Southern Pacific had put out about all the great things of coming to Texas. So he somehow landed in New York in 1884 and met up with George and Joe Walker of Paradise fame, and they took a wagon from somewhere in Texas and ended up in Galeyville. Well, Galeyville was pretty much dead by that time, and these guys weren't sure what they were going to do, but anyhow, they arrived in the Portal area in 1887. He was a prospector. His brother came out in 1888 by the name of Frank, and his other younger brother, Alfred, came in 1889. They established a little place to the east of Portal, which is called the Bush Place now, but back then, when John first came here, he stayed with the Reeds for bed and breakfast, or bed and board, effectively, I guess. Today it's bed and breakfast, but anyhow, he worked there for a year or so, and then the brothers prospected. Alfred came and took care of the livestock on their, whether it was a homestead or their home where their dugout was, and unfortunately, he was one of the last white people killed by Indians in 1896, in March 1896. He's buried up in the Reed burial area with the Reeds and others. Is presently owned by Ray Mendez. Anyhow, they prospected and looked at a lot of different things. And in 1913, they sold one of their prospects for $120,000. That was a hilltop mine. I guess there are a few people that are still around that might not remember that, but he had a lot of money, and I mean that was a lot of money at that time. So he had acquired a lot of land, and also he had quite a habit of being an archaeologist, or not a habit, but he did a lot of digs, because on the AVA on the south end of a lot of the area, there were a lot of Indian digs. I mean, we're talking thousands of years that they go back, plus the Apache. Well, anyhow, he passed on in 1939, and all his archaeological relics were put in here by Dr. Adamson, who built this for him in 1942. Of course, he was already dead by then. So he and Dr. Imahori, who was head of the University of Arizona Archaeology Department, Anthropology Department, put that all together. Well, anyhow, so much for the Hands. The next one that came along, and well, anyhow, Hands about the south 120 acres was what he contributed to the AVA Ranch. The next fellow that came along was William Stewart, and I mean, you recognize these names as their dams and mountains and a lot of things named for some of these people. But William Stewart was born in 1890 in Maine, grew up on a farm in Illinois, and came out and worked for the Forest Service somewhere between 1903 and 1905. He was a temporary forest ranger in the year 1908. The census shows him in 1910 in Paradise. But anyhow, he had been working for the forest. But he noticed a couple of things. But in 1911, he and Jim Ray decided to work on the Portal Ditch. Well, above the ranger station is a substantial head gate now, but back then they built almost a 3-mile ditch by hand. I guess they had some mules and Fresnos or whatever. But anyhow, They built that. Well, also he bought the AVA, or part of the AVA, then 120 acres, he paid $300, and then he acquired the next 80 acres to it. Well, then the next big year was 1913. Of course, it was for hens as well, but he planted 1,647 apple trees. Obviously, they had enough water to take care of them. And they also built a house about 1913-14. We planted the trees, married Eula Cheneth that year as well. Eula had been born in 1889. She taught school in Coral for 1911, 1912, and she's the youngest daughter of Gus Cheneth, another one of the old-timers that's showed up here in the late 1870s. Pretty basic house, I guess, but that's how they managed. Well, anyhow, they had really overextended themselves, and peach trees cost $580, and they mortgaged the whole place to Stark Brothers Nursery in Missouri. And so the brother Edward came out in that period of time and bought a third interest, which kind of got him out of trouble. Well, anyhow, they worked the orchard, they worked the ditch, and they did all they had to. Well, William all of a sudden died suddenly in 1919. Well, 1919, Eula felt that it wasn't proper for a widow to live on the same place with a bachelor, so she married Edward. Well, they had lots of battles with the ditches. By about this time, there was some adjudication about who had the water rights. Well, anyhow, poor old Edward died in 1922 in El Paso. And so things were complicated. To get through her probate and to get through all the mortgages and et cetera, she contacted David Benchmall in Douglas. Well, guess what? Next year they got married. And that lasted a few years, and then he died. He's living in Douglas. He's buried in Douglas. Well, anyhow, she married another lawyer by the name of Donald Rothrock, who was 5 years his younger. He survived somehow. Eula died in 1936. Anyhow, backing up a little bit, Eula's brother, Bob, or Robert, one-armed Bob, who had lost an arm in a hunting accident, was also known for his ability to make moonshine. Of course, this was dry time, so he came up and leased the ranch from 1926 to 1932. And I think everybody had a good time. His daughter, her name is Dorothy Jessie, and I asked her one time, and I was kind of serious, and I said, I think your Eula must have made a pretty mean strychnine stew. And she didn't even smile. So we're not sure what happened. Well, anyhow, 1932, Dr. Edward W. Adamson bought the place, and he was a physician in Douglas. He came to Douglas in 1910, practiced medicine. His office was in the north end of the Gadsden Hotel. And he bought the place for his second wife, Anna Van Brunt Adamson. And she was a horsey person, and so they bought it and did a lot of improvements. In 1935, he recognized with all the trees, the ditch wasn't reliable enough, that it didn't have water all the time, so he drilled a well. The well was drilled, and then they decided they better build a big tank. Well, Bert Roberts, who was another one of the old-timers, built this whole tank with a horse or mule drawn Fresno, and then they decided that didn't hold the water, so they concreted the whole thing, concreted the rock. But anyhow, that's about 110 feet across, 8 or 9 feet deep, and holds about 500,000 gallons, and a great swimming pool. Or a swimming hole, I should say. You had to be a pretty accomplished swimmer to be in there. And then, well, the next one was, then in 1935, he also hired a fellow by the name of Chris Rendon, and he apparently had been in Pancho Villa's army way back when, but he was a pretty talented and artistic mason, and you can see what he built. And all this wall of this barn is faced with concrete, for those of you who hadn't seen, and the rock work. But this is, as I say, built about 1935, and it's as strong as it was back then. The steel work all came from the old Phelps Dodge smelter that was built in the early 1900s. You can still see where they hot riveted the steel pieces that they that they had. Anyhow, then Mrs. Adamson died in 1944. Dr. Adamson kind of lost interest in the ranch, and that, of course, brings up to my father, where he was had been born in Austria, educated in Germany, and was brought over here in 1931. And he had a chance to come out west, and he just fell in love with the West. Well, anyhow, he had lived through World War I, the terror of World War I, and then in World War II, he was commissioned, or he wasn't commissioned, they made him a senior officer, and he, within a few weeks after World War II ended in Europe, he was in the bunker, the Führer's bunker, interpreting, because his German technical language was pretty good. But he also saw the devastation of World War II, because we still had family there. But anyhow, about this period of time, he was really concerned about the Cold War. And the Cold War, he didn't want his family to live through another thing as he had lived through and seen in 2 wars. So he decided, we're just going to come out to Arizona. Or he didn't decide. We stayed over at he had stayed at the Silversburg Guest Ranch, which is on the other side of the mountain. And that was started by Ruth and Ray Krant back in the 40s, and had taken over an LCCC camp and created a guest ranch. So anyhow, he had been there for a few years, and one day he said, you know, Ray, if I could find a place like this, I think I'd move out here. Well, he came over the top of the mountain and he bought the place on the spot. Well, not quite on the spot, but I mean, how they did it back then. Anyhow, this is how it looks today. Well, we arrived in June of 1953, a 13-year-old kid. Well, this was the day of Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and Hopalong and Lone Ranger. That was pretty exciting. And of course, we had horses, and we had a pretty good life. But anyhow, that's basically how we look today. And you can see we don't have much scenery. This is my father. He had a PhD in engineering, my mother, and my Aunt Gulstow, who had a PhD in pharmacology. And I mean, she was born in 1901, and so I guess sometimes, somewhere, women did have some opportunities to get education. And the guy in the right, you probably could recognize. I was a little younger, I think. In the early 50s, as we came out, the ranch has 2 basic parts, the farming part and the ranching part. The apple trees, of course, were quite old, and so under advice of the county agent and some others, we pulled out all the apples, re-leveled the land, and started replanting peaches in 1956. And of course, those are mature. You can see it snowed once in a while in Portal. It hadn't for a while. But anyhow, we had, you can see the results. We shipped an awful lot of peaches to the Safeway chains, both in El Paso chain and the Phoenix chain. And they were good. We could leave them on the trees longer than the California. So they had good flavor. Anyhow, backing up a little bit, in 1957, we had some excitement, and we were young kids. And Abby Rockefeller stayed at the research station for a summer. And my parents we had lots of hot dog and hamburger kind of get-togethers. And she came down with some of the other kids, and my mom thought she ought to be a good match for me. And she said, well, you know, when we have these parties and all the kids go out and play, Abby's the only one who comes and offers to help with the dishes. I guess that was a hint of some sort. Anyhow, also that summer, John Nichols, who wrote the Milagro Beanfield, was here in that period of time. Anyhow, that was part of as we went on to the peaches, we ultimately, we had about almost 10,000 trees. And that's a lot of work, and we had 4 families living on the place entirely, which of course helped support the school, helped support a lot of things. And we would use 20 to 40 more people for picking, packing, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately we phased out the trees as they got older. They just weren't, there was a number of things that happened. The market didn't change, just a lot of things changed. Anyhow, 1953, that's when I first got in the cattle business. 13-year-old, and this was my 4-H calf. And he was weighing almost 700 pounds, and we took him to the fair, and Blackie Stidham helped me select him, and took me into the fair, helped me an awful lot. Well, anyhow, we sold him, And I got 67 cents a pound, and I thought, well, that's a lot of money for a 13, 14-year-old kid. And at that period of time in the 50s, cattle were bringing about 20 cents a pound for steer calves. And if we could wean them at 250 pounds, we were doing well. And that was because it was primarily Herefords, and they had pink eye, and they had all kinds of problems. One of the big things were screwworms. And of course, we had one good government program that eliminated, they dropped the radiated flies, and it also ultimately eliminated our screwworm problem. But you just couldn't do much of anything because the flies would get to you. This was probably in the late 60s, branding in a crowd. Of course, the kids were watching. They didn't do a lot of helping, but that's okay. And this was probably gathering back in the early 70s. This, as we phased out the peach trees, I tried to determine what the heck we can do to plant that would be economic. So we looked at a lot of things. We looked at, one of the things we looked at was mushrooms. And I figured we had enough mine tunnels around here to do mushrooms. Well, if you don't have a market, it just didn't work. So we looked at wine at that time. We spent some time in Napa Valley, and we figured it would just cost way too much to get it started. And of course, in retrospect, I guess I should have, but that's the way it is. Well, you can see we generated or had a lot of hay, and they were good years. We still used the ditch, and of course the irrigation thing. And about this time, I also had converted from open ditch irrigation to a sprinkler system, and that was back in the late 60s, early 70s. Well, that was pretty high-tech stuff for then. Of course, our efficiency went probably for irrigation efficiency from what we pumped to what we got in the field, probably went from 50% to 90% because everything was in aluminum pipes. Anyhow, then in the early 70s, we had a tough deal. We had, if you'll remember, OPEC decided they weren't getting enough for the oil. And so we had, I mean, the prices went up pretty considerably. Well, we were pumping with propane and diesel, and our costs went up considerably. And then, of course, in 75, it went up even higher. And so I decided, this isn't going to work with the hay. And of course, the deer competed with us, and we just had a lot of other problems. But we did have enough equipment, and large enough equipment, that I could do a lot of not baling, cutting and baling and hauling hay for some of the neighbors, even though they were anonymous or quite a distance away. So we did some custom work, and that was okay, but it wasn't paying the bills. And when you have little kids, then you have insurance problems. And so in the mid-70s, Phelps Dodge contacted me, and they really wanted me to go to work for them. I said, I don't think I do. And they said, why don't you at least take a physical? And I said, well, that can't hurt me. And took the physical and ultimately went to work for them. Commuted back and forth for a number of years, and still had the cattle going. And of course, had a partner by the name of Bill Kibble, who he was teaching, and between us we managed to take care of the cattle. Anyhow, we go on to our weather, and people talk about the weather. If we look at 1967, those are 3 cars parked there in the front of the house, and there was almost 3 feet of snow. One of the biggest rainfalls at the ranger station was almost 28 inches. We haven't seen anything close to that in many moons. We also can talk about the cold, and we had a couple of people that worked on the ranch. One of them was Bill Sanders of Paradise fame, and Winston and relative. And one morning we were out working on the farm, and I said, Bill, it's sure cold. And Bill said, let me tell you about cold. He had been stationed in Siberia for 2 years from 1918 to 19. There were several other ones. Craig McEwen wrote a story about it, and it's kind of interesting. The other one was George Stoner, who was a foreman in the 60s, and we were talking about the same thing, it's cold, and George said, you don't know what cold is. I was up on Attu for 2 years during World War II. His heirs or son still lives in Rodeo. So we've had a lot of people, we've had a lot of burials. Eula, of course, is her ashes are on the limestone mountain. I know the Stewart brothers and Hands, and there's several. We've had a lot of burials, and we've also had lots of births there. So it's been around for a long time. It's, as I say, when you look at from 1885 to 1906, 1911, that's how long ago. The weather is critical to any agriculture. Our organization, we'll see, used to be in rodeo a lot of farms. We're not seeing very many anymore. They're all gone, and partly the water, partly other reasons. Big excitement. Before this, early in the 90s, one of the Beatles decided that he needed maybe he needed to buy the ranch. This was Paul McCartney. And I started thinking, what would happen if I would have sold to Paul McCartney? What would Portal look like today? And that's a good guess for anybody. And now I look back and maybe I should have sold it, I don't know. Anyhow, also about that period of time, they filmed a movie by the name of Geronimo. That was Ted Turner's movie. And he wanted to have as authentic a movie as he could for Geronimo. So we weren't in the movie, but we kept all of their livestock, and I think they paid us $1,000 a day to keep. So that was a nice thing to have. Well, 1950 with Dr. Adamson, they filmed the movie Brandon, and this was Alan Ladd's probably the movie before Shane. And it was, I wasn't there, but it was pretty exciting. You can see the buildings. They built a lot of the buildings, and it was just the front of the buildings. And of course, there's Alan Ladd. He wasn't a giant of a man, but he was okay. He did a good job. This corral they built, and we tore it down a few years ago. You can see the apple trees in the background. Of course, you recognize hills and one of the buildings they built there. This was the house, and again, all it was a front. It wasn't, wasn't a house, but you can again see Cathedral Rock. And that leads us to what happened at the end of it. We think tomorrow we're going to see the movie, and for you that haven't seen it, it's kind of interesting, it's kind of funky, but it's many years old. And that would kind of conclude our thumbnail sketch. We thank Kim and of course Bob and Sherry for their neat facility. And for all you coming, as I say, you can't cover everything in a half an hour with over 100 years. A lot of people and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears goes into the thing. As I say, I've owned it for 51 years now, and we're still hanging in there. But it's not an easy task to own a big chunk of land. Everybody and his brothers works on it, whether it's taxes or insurance or whatever. Anyhow, that'll conclude my little talk. Any questions?
Ted, you alluded to ABA.
I'm sorry, I overlooked
But
that.
you didn't say the name. You didn't actually give us what ABA meant.
ABA was Anna Van Brunt.
That's
Adamson, probably in the early 30s, whether they created the brand or whether they bought the brand from somewhere, we don't know.
so the ABA. You had a brand on ABA.
ABA, and it's not AVA, it's ABA.
ABA. So
And
what does the ABA brand look like? The same?
Just two A's together. I mean, the brand.
That's it, right? That's
And it makes
A
it
and
B.
B. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, I forgot that part, but anyhow, got most of it. Anything else? Good.
Any peach trees left, producer?
No. 10,000 trees, and unfortunately with the market, with the number of things that happened, we pulled them out. But the market very drastically changed. Also the labor and the labor costs changed. There were just a lot of things that it was a great idea. And of course I wanted to go back to Apples and talk to our marketing people, and they said Washington State would just bury it, those big co-ops. So, and I said, we can leave them on the trees for an extra week. They said they don't care. And as you know, when you buy most fresh produce today, it doesn't particularly have a good flavor, unless you grow it yourself.
It's true.
Read?
You're still doing hay?
Hay? No. No, we're still watering. And one of the things that I had done is decided that anything that you had to use pumping system is going to be very expensive, so we've been using the ditch. So in 1990, we tested one of the plots where I've been planting a lot of grass. We produced 6,000 pounds of grass per acre, which means that you could carry over 100 cows per section. And per section today, we're looking at most of this country, maybe 10 cows per section. So it would have made it makes a significant difference if the ditch is running, and I mean, you just can't afford this. You know, we're talking 25 cents a gallon diesel, and you're talking $3 today. Well, it just doesn't make sense unless you have a high, something that really makes a lot of money.
What did you do about bears when you had your orchards?
Well, it's kind of funny, but there were so many trees, sometimes we didn't notice it. But one day I was out walking, and there were a bunch of cottonwoods. In 1978, we had a huge freeze, and it killed lots of cottonwoods down in the sea in lots of areas. Anyhow, I saw this strange-looking splotch on the ground. I didn't pay any attention. I went by in the afternoon, I saw a little bigger splotch, and I said, what the hell? And the third time I looked up, and here's a little baby bear just hanging over the branch. And he'd come down, eat peaches, go back up and have diarrhea. Well, I wasn't underneath him. But we've had, lots of issues of you name it, that we just survived. Eric?
Do you still have the cement pond?
Yep.
Is it still filtered water?
No, about a number of years ago, one of the foreman's sons went up and drowned. And his name was Williams, and after that we just didn't use it. Of course, way back when we didn't understand the efficiencies of evaporation. Well, you're talking 110 feet across, we're talking evaporation that was pretty major. It's the tank's still there.
But does it catch like rainwater?
No, because we used to run the creek water and pump in there, but it's not now probably doing a good job. We have to put some kind of a liner in it. But they used it way back when for fire, when they dip in with a fire bag and for fires. And bam, that's how it changes. Good place to go swimming. I can't remember how many laps it took to swim a mile, but I used to do that. That's cold water.
Teddy, tell about being a high schooler and going to school by train to Douglas.
Well, one of the things from back in the olden days, and I don't think there's anybody here that remembers when there was still train and bus service, but when we were in high school, we boarded in town. At that period of time, we couldn't, it's a good hour to Animas or a good hour to San Simon. Of course, neither school was accredited if you wanted to go to college. So anyhow, going back and forth, that was a long trip. So some days my sister, especially after vacation, my sister would go on to the University of Arizona and I'd go to Douglas, and we'd get on the train at 3 in the afternoon. That was kind of a neat thing. Or sometimes we'd catch the bus at the hotel in Rodeo and take the bus. Anyhow, we thank you all.